They say the warp remembers every god it ever devoured, every scream, every dream, every crown claimed in another universe. Somewhere, beyond the stars of the segmentum obscurus, the Imperium stirs. A storm older than the Imperium itself, whispering in a tongue that no psyker can survive hearing. And from that storm a shadow takes form, a presence not of this galaxy, not of this reality, but of another age, an age where fire ruled, and a single will sought to bind creation itself. He was once called the Dark Lord, the one who forged dominion in the fires of Orodruin, a being not born of flesh but of will, of endless hunger for order and power. And now imagine that while stepping across the boundary between legend and nightmare. Imagine Sauron, the Maya of corruption, the forger of the One Ring, and entering the Eye of Terror. Would the Chaos God see a rival or a reflection? Would he kneel before the ruinous powers or forge them into his own dominion? Would the galaxy burn beneath a new Dark Lord? Or would even Sauron be unmade by the raw madness of the warp? This is not myth. This is speculation carved in iron. A collision between two universes of ruin and divinity. This is what happens when Sauron meets the Eye of Terror. If the fires of this thought already stir the imagination, if you live for the impossible questions that only grimdark can answer, then subscribe, share this chronicle, and stay until the end, because some myths should never meet, and yet tonight we will watch them collide. In the farthest reaches of the Imperium, where time folds upon itself and even the gods whisper only in symbols, something ancient stirs, something that does not belong. The warp has always been a reflection of mortal will, a storm of souls, desire, and madness. But now a ripple spreads through that storm, not from within but from without. It is a soundless tremor, like the first note of an unplayed chord. Across dimensions, through cracks between creation itself, something descends. It is not a demon. It is not a god of this realm. It is will made manifest, an intellect forged in the fires of another universe, bound not by flesh but by intention. In the beginning, there is only light and resistance. The warp resists all that is order, all that dares to shape it. Yet here is a force born of perfect design, a being who once crafted rings to bind the spirits of kings and enslaved nations through harmony and structure. Now that same harmony claws its way into a realm made of discord. The warp recoils. The sea of raw motion flares like a wound exposed to salt. Demons howl without understanding why. Psychic currents reverse. Even the great storms above the Eye of Terror shift their hue, crimson blending into bronze, bronze into molten gold. The intrusion is subtle at first, like a whisper, but then it grows, a pulse that turns into a heartbeat. And then, a shape forms, a shadow wrapped in fire, tall and robed in smoke, falling endlessly through a sky that is not sky at all but thought. Nightmare and memory fuse together. His armor gleams with heatless embers, each plate a reflection of his former world. The sigils of Mordor now warped into runes that burn in languages no demon can read. Around his wrists coil chains of light and iron, fragments of the old world clinging to him like memory. He crashes into the madness. The impact is not physical. It is metaphysical, like logic smashing into dream. Where he lands, the tides of unreality convulse. A hole opens in the chaos, a crater of structured thought. For the first time in eons, something in the warp hesitates. The demons gather. They sense the arrival, but they cannot define it. It feels ancient, older even than their gods, and yet alien, wrong, not born of human fear or desire. They whisper among themselves in sibilant voices that melt and reform. What is this that burns but is not flesh? What is this that commands but does not pray? He does not answer. He cannot speak their tongue, not yet. His first breath in this place is like inhaling molten iron. Every sensation assaults him. Memories of millions, centuries of sin, entire civilizations screaming across eternity. But the Maya endures. He has walked through the void before. He has served dark masters and defied them. He has fallen, been shattered, and reformed from nothing. He knows pain. He is will. The warp tries to consume him, tendrils of thought venom and nightmare pressing against his essence. But they burn away upon contact. The fire that lives within him is not of this galaxy. It is the flame of all his forge, the divine spark of creation twisted into domination. For every daemon that touches him, there is the sound of metal shrieking and light being born where no light should exist. At first, the warp reacts with violence. Rivers of crimson thought crash against him. Horrors form, faces, wings, fangs, claws, but they dissolve before his gaze. He does not strike them down. He unmakes them. His very presence reasserts the notion of order in a place built on chaos. It is an infection of logic, a paradox that the Imperium cannot yet resolve. And so the warp watches. Across the eye of terror, unseen entities stir. In the depths of the maelstrom, where cults pray to voices they will never comprehend, prophets wake screaming of the burning stranger and the god who wears reason. On demon worlds, the skies shift, showing for a moment a figure descending through endless fire, his shape framed by a single ring of light. Sauron has arrived, the Lord of Mordor, stripped of his flesh, reborn as will alone, has crossed the veil. His senses adjust slowly, not to matter, but to madness. The eye that once watched Middle-earth now opens upon a cosmos of endless horror, and it widens in fascination. He can feel it, the power of this place, the infinite hunger of unshaped emotion. It is raw, impure, and boundless. For the first time since his fall, he senses something akin to home. He begins to walk, though walking here means thought given direction. The warp shifts beneath his every step, folding like molten glass. Each motion leaves behind trails of coherence, ripples of geometry where there should be none. The demons recoil from his presence, unsure whether to worship or flee. They whisper a new name for him, the stranger of order, the flame that binds. To them, he feels like heresy made manifest, a creator who does not draw power from faith but from will itself. And somewhere in the immeasurable distance, something ancient begins to laugh, a laughter that has echoed through time since the first heresy. Cold and knowing, Tzeentch has noticed, the warp had known intruders before, mortals who reached too far, psychers who opened their minds like wounds. Even the chaos gods themselves were once born of lesser things, of thought and emotion rising into something divine. But this presence was different. It had not emerged from faith or madness. It had come from beyond both, crossing the boundaries of creation through sheer inevitability. Sauron stood upon nothing, yet the nothing bowed to him. Around him, the tides of the Imperium shivered and twisted, trying to absorb this anomaly. He could feel its sentience everywhere, the infinite mind of the warp itself pulsing in every direction, curious and hostile all at once. It probed at him, sliding invisible tendrils across his essence, tasting what he was made of, and what it found was alien. No mortal dream, no psychic echo, but a will born before humanity ever looked to the stars. A shape began to coalesce from the mists ahead, vast, amorphous, flickering between colors that had never existed. It was not a demon, not even a god, but a representation, the way the warp chose to greet him. Its form changed with every thought, wings folding into serpents, serpents twisting into burning eyes, eyes splitting into mouths that spoke and swallowed each other. It whispered, words that were not words, meanings layered over meanings, the voice of the warp itself. What are you, fire that does not die? What world vomited you forth? You are structure in a sea that knows no shape. Sauron did not answer at first. He had learned long ago that power lies in silence. The voice pressed closer, trying to find a way in. You are alone here. There are no thrones but ours. No law but hunger. What seeks a godling among gods? He raised his gaze, and where eyes would have been, twin furnaces burned. When he finally spoke, the sound was like a hammer on an anvil, echoing through the immaterial as if striking the bones of reality itself. I seek dominion. The warp laughed, or something close to it. The sound was endless and layered, laughter from a million mouths that were not mouths. Dominion, it said. There is no dominion here. There is only change. Sauron extended his hand. Fire leapt from his palm. Not flame as mortals know it, but the pure concept of command. It burned not outward but inward, asserting itself against the sea of madness. The laughter faltered. The nearest shapes began to crystallize as if forced into form by his will. Chaos for a moment became order. That was when the first of the great powers truly turned its eye upon him. From the shifting currents of the warp, an intelligence ancient and fluid began to weave around the intruder. Tzeentch, the architect of fate, the great deceiver. To lesser minds he was illusion and paradox. To Sauron he felt like familiarity, a mind that believed in planning, in schemes, in control. A voice threaded through the ether, smoother now, deliberate, mocking, yet fascinated. You are like me, it said, a forger of destiny, a maker of laws. But tell me, stranger, what forge births fire strong enough to burn the warp itself? Sauron felt the touch of Tzeentch like the brush of wind over molten metal. The god probed for weakness, for thought, for memory. It found fragments, the ring, the mountain, the fall, and tasted the bitterness of defeat that still lingered in him. Ah, the voice rippled with amusement. A spirit of order fallen from grace. You dream of dominion but are haunted by loss. You sought to bind gods once. Would you try again? The Maya did not flinch. His essence flared brighter, his shadow stretching across the immaterial like a blade of obsidian. You are a god of change, he said. But change without purpose is decay. I am not your mirror, architect. I am what you fear, structure eternal, form that will not yield. The warp shuddered at the defiance. Tzeentch's laughter turned sharper, cutting 1,000 mocking tones. Eternal? There is no such thing here, Flameborn. You will learn, or you will dissolve. Then came the test. The very substance of the Imperium bent against him. Visions of past and future folding into nightmare. Sauron saw himself drowning in formless light, his will stripped bare, his essence scattered among the demons that clawed at him. The temptation was not death, but surrender, to give in to the sea, to be part of the chaos rather than its master. For a heartbeat, if heartbeats had meaning here, he felt the pull. He remembered the ring, the endless weight of it, the perfect circle that enslaved even its maker, the lesson of his own downfall. Power uncontrolled is power lost, and then he resisted. The warp convulsed as he asserted himself again, his will burning through illusion, carving out a sphere of stability around him, a throne of fire and glass suspended in the storm. Demons that had crept near shrieked and dissolved, their forms undone by coherence. Tzeentch's voice fell silent. For the first time in millennia, the architect of fate paused to observe. Something had entered his realm that could not be predicted, something that changed without permission. Sauron's voice echoed through the stillness calm, commanding as he raised his hand to the void. I do not dissolve, he said. I shape. And for the first time, the warp began to learn what that meant. There are moments in the warp when the storm holds its breath, when the tides of madness and memory still, not in peace but in anticipation. Sauron's defiance had created one such silence. For the first time in an age, the Imperium, an ocean of thought where gods devoured each other endlessly, had been forced to listen. At the heart of that silence, 4 ancient hungers turned their gaze. They were not creatures, not entities as mortals understood them, but living laws, concepts so absolute that even their thoughts bled into reality. The demon princes of the eye trembled as their gods stirred. For something foreign had entered their dominion, something that burned with the strength of creation, yet denied worship and chaos alike. In the brass citadel, amidst the endless rivers of blood and bone, Khorne lifted his blade. The air around him hissed with molten fury, the sound of 1 billion battles screaming at once. He had felt Sauron's arrival like the tolling of a war bell, a challenge cast across eternity. To Khorne, this being was no sorcerer's trick. He smelled defiance, pride, conquest. These were not sins in his eyes, but provocations. Something dares, the blood god rumbled, his voice splitting mountains of skulls. Something that bleeds fire but not fear. Across the void in the Garden of Decay, Nurgle stirred among his rotting thrones. He felt it differently. Where Khorne saw defiance, Nurgle saw endurance. The new presence did not rot. It persisted. It refused entropy. To the Lord of Plagues, such resilience was a kind of kinship, a stubbornness that mirrored his own. He chuckled, a sound like collapsing lungs. How curious, he murmured, lifting a hand the color of mold and dusk. A thing that will not die, a flower that grows in poison. Farther still, where light twisted into geometry and reality folded upon itself, Tzeentch observed from his crystalline tower. The architect of fate needed no introduction to this invader. He had already spoken to it. He had already tried and failed to unravel it. That failure was intoxicating. To Tzeentch, Sauron was a puzzle that did not yield to foresight. And in that unpredictability lay the rarest of things in the warp, possibility. He smiled, though the expression spanned 1,000 faces. So the flame endures, he whispered. Good, let it burn. Let it teach the warp what it means to resist change. And somewhere between pleasure and horror, Slaanesh awoke. The Prince of Excess had sensed the new will like the first note of a perfect symphony. It was not beauty that drew Slaanesh nor pain. It was the discipline. The precision with which Sauron commanded his existence. A creature of perfect control was by nature irresistible. It was temptation unfulfilled. How divine, Slaanesh cooed, draped across veils of living silk. A god who forbids indulgence. A maker who refuses his own pleasure. What exquisite repression. I must have it. Thus the four gazes converged. The eye of terror flared like a wound reopening. All across the galaxy, psychers screamed as vision struck them. Shards of the same moment echoing across worlds. They saw a towering shadow crowned in flame, walking through void and nightmare unbent. They saw demons kneel not in devotion but in confusion. They saw the warp hesitate, and in that hesitation the galaxy trembled. In the material realm, navigators charting the void saw the Astronomican flicker. Astropaths convulsed in agony. The Inquisition whispered of a fifth presence moving through the currents of the Imperium, a distortion not born of chaos but of order. Some thought it a trick of Tzeentch, others called it a heresy that dared define the indefinable. But within the warp itself, the gods conspired. Khorne's realm quaked as the blood god rose from his throne of skulls, chains clattering across his armor. "If this creature believes itself strong, let it be tested," he roared. "Let it bleed. Let it fight." Tzeentch's laughter wove through the thunder. "Test it, yes. Let us see if the stranger knows pain." Slaanesh's tone melted into the void like perfume. "No, let us tempt it. A being of control may resist the blade, but not desire." And from his garden of rot, Nurgle's chuckle spread like contagion. "All things yield to time, my loves. We need not fight it. We need only wait." Their debate rippled through the warp like a storm of meaning. Reality itself twisted as their attention converged. The skies above Sauron darkened, not with clouds but with thoughts made flesh. Faces and forms swirled together in a hurricane of gods. He felt them before he saw them. The pressure of their collective will pressed against his essence like gravity made from hunger. In their presence even demon princes knelt, their forms melting under divine scrutiny. But the Maya stood unmoved. He had once looked upon Valar. He had once served under Morgoth himself. Compared to that abyssal tyranny, this was chaos. Loud, furious, undisciplined. He raised his hand and the void rippled around it. His voice cut through their cacophony like molten iron through silk. "I see you." The warp froze. The words carried the weight of creation. "I know what you are," he said. "Fragments of impulse, reflections of mortal need. You are will without unity, hunger without harmony. I am not your servant nor your prey. I am dominion given form." The demon screamed as the light flared from his armor, cutting through the darkness. His words were not defiance. They were proclamation. And for the first time since the birth of chaos, something spoke to the four as an equal. The Imperium trembled under the weight of what followed. For countless eons, the four had quarreled, devoured, and remade each other in endless cycles of dominance. But never before had their hunger been united by curiosity. Now every thought within the warp leaned toward a single point, a figure of perfect will standing against their storm. The first to act was Khorne. His fury could not abide a challenge untested. In the forges of his citadel, the blood god lifted his axe and a river of molten brass erupted across the sky. It flowed through the void, manifesting as armies of demons, bloodletters by the legion, skull cannons roaring through the ether. They fell upon Sauron's domain with thunderous fury, their battle cries forming a single wordless hymn. Blood. The Maya stood at the center of his newborn dominion, a sphere of ordered flame within the chaos, and watched their charge. His gaze did not falter. When the first demon struck, its blade of hate met a wall of shimmering fire. The sound was like reality shattering. He raised his hand and the fire folded upon itself, condensing into a molten edge. A blade not of steel but of command, forged from his very will. With a single motion, he cut through the first rank. There was no gore, no victory cry, only silence as the demons dissolved into ash and vanished into the warp's current. Others followed, hundreds, then thousands, their rage endless but their purpose aimless. They fought for slaughter. He fought for order. And in that difference lay his victory. At the edge of the battlefield, Khorne watched through fire and smoke. For the first time, he saw an enemy who did not revel, who did not scream or curse. This was not passion. It was judgment. The blood god snarled, his laughter booming like thunder. A god who fights without hatred, he mused. How pitiful, and yet how pure. Sauron stood unscathed amid the ruins of the demon's charge. He looked into the distance as if he could see Khorne through the storms themselves. You are war without reason, he said quietly, his voice carrying even here. You are strength without law. I have broken such powers before. The warp rippled with the impact of his words. Khorne roared, and the sound tore through realities. But even as fury consumed the horizon, a new voice coiled around them, a whisper so cold it made the fire flicker. Tzeentch had returned. The architect of fate had no interest in brute contests. He approached through vision and deceit. The skies above Sauron shimmered, the flame-dark air bending into endless reflections of himself. In one, he was crowned upon a throne of light. In another, he knelt before an unseen power. In a third, he held a golden ring that pulsed like a heartbeat, whispering words he had buried long ago. You remember it? Tzeentch murmured. The perfect circle. The power that could bind all will into one. Sauron froze. The illusion had struck deeper than blade or flame. The ring's image hovered before him, flawless, whole, unbroken by the flames of Mount Doom. The whisper continued. You could forge again here. Not in stone, but in spirit. A ring for every demon, every god. Imagine it, an ordered warp, every madness enslaved to your purpose. The temptation was exquisite and terrible. Sauron's flame dimmed for a breath. The thought, so perfect, so rational, pierced even his iron resolve. He could see it, the forges of the Imperium rebuilt under his rule, chaos itself tamed into law. But then he saw further, the truth behind the illusion. The chains that bound every forger to his forge, the corruption that turns every creation inward. He had seen it once before when the ring had ruled even him. He closed his hand and the image shattered into molten shards that hissed as they fell into nothingness. Your visions are lies, he said. You mistake my memory for my desire. For the first time, Tzeentch faltered. From the shadows of that hesitation came a voice like decay made gentle. A laughter that bloomed in the cracks of things. Nurgle emerged, not as an army or an illusion, but as presence. The warp around Sauron grew heavy with scent. Earth after rain rot beneath renewal. Why struggle? Nurgle asked, his tone soft, almost paternal. You build and burn and build again. You could rest, little god. You could let go. The warp devours all, yet I nurture what remains. Let yourself dissolve and you will be free. Sauron turned to face the mist that carried that voice. Freedom through surrender, he said. Your mercy is another kind of death. The air thickened, pressing against his will. For a moment his fire flickered under the weight of entropy. His armor darkened, tarnish creeping over its surface. But he stood fast. His defiance like a spark in the swamp. Then decay alone, Nurgle sighed and withdrew, leaving behind silence and the faint perfume of ruin. And through that silence, Slaanesh arrived. No storm heralded the Prince of Excess. The light simply changed, softened, becoming honey and gold. The air sang. Every chain, every ember gleamed like art. From the void stepped a figure of impossible beauty, androgynous and perfect, eyes gleaming like broken mirrors. You resist war, lies and death, Slaanesh said, but can you resist longing? The prince's presence enveloped him, not as force but as invitation. Sauron's senses flooded, visions of a world remade, every creation obedient yet joyous, every will singing in harmony. It was beauty, not chaos. The perfection he had once sought now offered freely. But beauty offered freely is never free. He lifted his gaze, and in those silver eyes saw his own reflection, kneeling. The illusion shattered. The warmth turned cold. Slaanesh's smile faltered as his prey stood unbent. Desire is the chain of the weak, Sauron said, and I have broken mine. The prince's laughter melted into the void, equal parts admiration and fury. When it was done, when the storm of the gods had receded, the warp was quiet once more. Sauron stood alone at the heart of his dominion, flame steady, unbroken. But though he had resisted them all, he understood now the truth of where he stood. The warp could not be conquered by fire alone. It was alive, and it had begun to learn him. There is no true ground in the warp, no solid sky, no fixed horizon. Yet where Sauron walked, the unshaped became shape. The sea of madness bent under discipline. Slowly, like molten glass cooling under a craftsman's breath, a world began to cohere around him. At first, it was nothing more than a sphere of fire and geometry suspended within infinity, but with each pulse of his will the shape deepened. Platforms, terraces, towers of blackened metal and light. Chains of molten gold anchored the structure to nothing, holding it steady in the formless void. It was not built. It was willed. The warp, accustomed to randomness, struggled to understand what it saw. Demons circled the forming citadel, drawn by curiosity and fear. They felt in that structure a violation of their essence, something that was not supposed to exist. The warp was chaos, yet here was design. Here was a god of will carving meaning into madness. The forges blazed with fire that did not burn. In their glow, shapes began to emerge. Constructs of thought and memory, reflections of the Maya's ancient art. His servants were not men nor orcs nor spirits as before, but phantoms of order. Each was bound by runes carved into its soul, demons reshaped, reforged. The first of them crawled from the molten earth on hands of iron and flame. They bowed their heads and spoke not in worship but in obedience. He named them the Forged. They worked without rest, hammering the intangible into permanence. Great anvils rang with soundless resonance as will became matter, and matter became dominion. The citadel grew. Vast black walls with veins of gold that pulsed like arteries. A fortress that reflected no light because it was light. Every tower reached upward, not toward heaven but toward authority itself. In time, a new throne took shape at its core. It was not meant for comfort or ceremony. It was a statement. Upon it, Sauron sat, his flame steady, his gaze deep, his dominion forming like an infection spreading through the Imperium. Around him, the Forged labored, their chants a rhythm that even the warp began to echo. The air thickened with power. Across the Eye of Terror, demons began to dream of the citadel. They saw a mountain of fire and metal rising in the heart of the storm, an architecture that defied entropy. Some were drawn toward it, seeking the new god who promised form. Others fled, fearing extinction. Even the great lords of chaos felt its influence. Sinch observed it through 1,000 eyes, fascinated and enraged. Khorne's realm shook as his rivers of blood began to flow slower near its border, their course subtly diverted. To the warp, the citadel was poison, an act of order imposed upon the infinite. But to Sauron it was purpose incarnate. He stood at the edge of his creation and looked outward. The storms of unreality raged beyond, full of faces and whispers, yet none dared cross the border of his will. He raised his hand and runes of fire coiled through the air. They were not words of the warp but of Ea, the ancient speech of the Ainur, the music of creation itself. The demons shrieked when they heard it, for it hurt them to recognize meaning. With that song, he began the next act, forging not tools, but weapons. From the maelstrom's heat he drew blades of flame that never cooled. He bound demons within armor that sang with their own screams. His smith shaped rings of energy, each one inscribed with a fraction of his will, not to enslave kings but to anchor his power across the formless sea. These rings burned like miniature suns in the void, tethering fragments of reality together. And with every act of creation, the warp remembered. It remembered how to resist. The gods grew restless. Khorne's fury deepened into hatred. Nurgle's curiosity soured into disgust. Sinch calculated and recalculated and found no pattern he could predict. Even Slaanesh, who had seen beauty in Sauron's defiance, now whispered jealousy. Something impossible was happening. The warp, for the first time in its history, was changing against its will. Sauron knew this. He felt the resistance in the air, the tightening of reality around him. The storms grew violent, clawing at his citadel's edges, hurling shards of madness like stones against a wall. But the fortress held. The fire did not waver, and through the maelstrom, a voice called to him. It was not one of the four. It was something older, deeper. A whisper from the center of the warp itself, a sound like creation being remembered. It spoke without words, but its meaning was clear. You do not belong here. Sauron's fire flared in response. His voice was calm, cold, absolute. I belong wherever I impose my will. The warp recoiled. The storm split. For a moment, even the Eye of Terror seemed to shrink. A living abyss confronted by something that refused to die. And deep within the citadel's heart, the forges screamed louder, the rhythm of creation defying the void. The citadel did not stay silent for long. Nothing in the warp can remain untouched. Every act echoes, and every echo breeds consequence. Sauron's fortress, born of order, radiated through the Imperium like a forbidden song, a melody that did not change, a rhythm that did not yield. In a realm of endless flux, such constancy was heresy, yet to some it was salvation. The first to come were the Wanderers, fragments of broken psychers, lost imperial souls who had slipped from reality through madness or misjudged warp jumps. They were beings twisted by exposure, no longer human but not yet demon. They drifted aimlessly for eternity, condemned to dissolve into the screaming tides. Until now, they felt the pull before they saw it, a current of calm, a gravity of will. Some resisted, believing it to be another trap of the ruinous powers. Others followed, compelled by something ancient in their blood that longed for purpose. When they reached the citadel, they fell to their knees, trembling, their fractured minds briefly restored in the presence of coherence. Sauron stood upon the ramparts as they gathered. He looked upon their ruined forms, eyes hollow, souls threadbare, and saw utility. "Serve," he said simply, "and endure." Those who obeyed were remade. The forges consumed them, reforging their essence into shapes of function. Some became sentinels, armor-clad wraiths bound by law, their bodies inscribed with the runes of order. Others became architects, their memories twisted into understanding. From chaos he drew hierarchy. From despair he extracted obedience. The demons saw this and trembled. Never had the warp's raw matter been forced into such alignment. But curiosity is a dangerous thing in the Imperium. They began to approach in secret, drawn by fascination, envy, or fear. Some came to challenge, others came to beg. One among them, a greater demon of Tzeentch, feathers of shifting light and eyes that saw futures collapsing, crossed the boundary, sneering. "You forge order in the sea of dreams," it hissed. "But order is not eternal here. The warp devours all, even gods fade." Sauron turned slowly. His eyes glowed like twin forges. "Then I will devour it." The demon struck, unleashing waves of transmuting flame, every strike a rewriting of existence. But Sauron met its sorcery with something older than magic. Will shaped into purpose. The forges behind him pulsed, answering his command. The air hardened, runes flaring in spirals. Each swing of the demon's claw found resistance. Each curse it spoke was silenced by the sound of hammer and anvil echoing across the citadel. When the creature fell, its body dissolved not into ash but into form. Sauron reached into the residue and reshaped it, sealing its essence within armor of blackened gold. "You will serve," he said, and it did. The others saw, and the lesson spread like contagion. Soon, the citadel was no longer alone. Smaller fortresses rose around it, fragments of order tethered to the great forge. Demons who had once fed on chaos began to seek its flame for stability, their endless pain dulled by submission. They knelt and were changed, their forms simplified, purified, hardened. They became the bound legions, warped reflections of the armies of Mordor. Where once stood howling beasts, now marched soldiers of symmetry and silence. It was an abomination. To the chaos gods it was treason. The warp convulsed. Storms erupted from the borders of every divine realm. Khorne's rivers overflowed, spilling bloodfire into the void. Tzeentch's realms twisted in feverish contradiction, trying to undo what could not be undone. Nurgle's plague winds blew, but the citadel did not rot. It only grew stronger, feeding on its defiance. Even Slaanesh's domain vibrated with a note of unease. The Prince of Excess uncertain whether to worship or destroy this new perfection. And so it began, the first war of its kind. Not of gods against mortals, but of chaos against order. The legions of the warp gathered like stormfronts. Countless demons, corrupted souls, and divine horrors turned toward the citadel, their hatred boiling into existence. They did not march as armies do in reality. They collapsed across the void, folding distance like paper until they stood at its borders. Their presence warped even the flame of Sauron's domain. At the heart of his fortress, Sauron prepared. He stood before his forge, surrounded by the clamor of the bound. Chains rattled. The air glowed with molten light. Before him hung a vast object suspended by energy, a single ring of blackened metal, incomplete but pulsing with power. It was not the ring of his old world, but a new creation, a conduit, an anchor. a weapon designed to bind not men, but realities. As the armies of the gods closed in, he pressed his hand to its surface. The metal screamed like something alive. Sparks of unreal color burst forth, painting the air with geometry. The bound fell to their knees. The forges flared until their light burned through the warp's darkness. When the storm hit, it met not a fortress, but a world. The collision was unlike anything the Imperium had ever known. Demons screamed as their forms broke upon invisible walls of meaning. Nurgle's plagues withered into dust before the logic of Sauron's creation. Khorne's legions threw themselves upon the barrier and were unmade. Their fury turned into silence, and above it all the architect watched in rapture and horror, realizing that something was happening that he, the god of fate, could not foresee. For the first time in eternity the warp bled, and within that bleeding, Sauron smiled. He had found the secret heart of this universe, not faith, not emotion, but structure. It was the key to dominion, the mirror of creation itself. He would not flee the gods. He would replace them. But even victory carries its price. In the depths of his forge, the ring pulsed with growing hunger, feeding on the chaos it consumed. The Maya's fire flickered, and for a brief moment, the light that was his will looked back at him and smiled. There are wars fought with weapons, and then there are wars fought with truth. The Battle of the Maelstrom began like any other storm in the warp. Thunder without sound, light without form. But beneath the madness there was direction, will, and fury. The four had set aside their rivalries, if only for an instant, united by one necessity, the unmaking of the intruder who dared impose order upon infinity. From the skies of blood came Khorne's armies, rivers of molten rage cascading through the void like comets. From the depths of rot crawled Nurgle's plagues, living fogs that devoured time itself. Tzeentch's sorceries coiled through the ether, rewriting the laws of causality with every pulse, and draped upon the horizon like silk over a blade. Slaaneish's temptations whispered across the battlefield, promising ecstasy, power, release. At the center stood Sauron, the Dark Maya, the forger of wills, and upon the ramparts of his citadel, his fire burned cold now, refined through countless confrontations. Around him marched the bound legions, a thousand echoes of obedience forged from chaos itself. Their armor sang in unison, each movement an act of perfect rhythm. When the storm broke, the warp screamed. Khorne struck first. His roar split the immaterial heavens, a sound that shattered lesser demons by proximity alone. His axe, a mountain-sized wedge of iron carved from the bones of dead realities, fell toward the citadel. The impact could have erased planets, but the blow stopped inches from Sauron's barrier. The shockwave rolled through the void, bending space, crushing demons into dust. Yet the wall held. From behind that wall, Sauron spoke. His voice was not thunder, but decree. You mistake fury for power. The words spread through the battlefield like commandment. Khorne's axe cracked, not from weakness, but from definition. The warp was not meant to obey structure. Yet Sauron's will gave it one. The fragments of divine metal scattered, screaming in protest against the very concept of order. Khorne staggered. It had been eons since he had felt anything resembling resistance. Blood boiled into flame. His laughter echoed across 1,000 worlds. Then fight me, forger. No walls, no thought, only rage. He lunged again and found himself trapped. Sauron had not moved, yet the space between them folded like glass. The blood god's strike was caught not by shield or weapon, but by law. The very geometry of Sauron's will rewrote the terrain, turning wrath into stasis. Each of Khorne's blows became motionless, frozen mid-swing, suspended as sculpture. From the shadows of that impossible stillness came another voice, sly, serpentine, amused. You make such noise, brother, Tzeentch whispered, appearing in a flare of impossible color. His form split into mirrors, each reflection a different shape. Allow me a turn. The architect extended his hand and the sky bled into possibility. The fortress vanished, reappeared, multiplied. The bound dissolved into probability waves, their existence fragmented across futures that had not yet been written. Time shivered, unmoored. Sauron's citadel was dragged into the current, not destroyed, but unmade into options. For any other being, this would have been the end. But Sauron understood creation. He was born from the music of the Ainur, the first great order of existence. He had once shaped mountains with melody, oceans with rhythm, and now in the heart of madness he remembered the song. He closed his eyes, his fire dimmed, and then beneath the shriek of chaos a note sounded, low, deep, eternal. It was not beautiful. It was inevitable. The note vibrated through the warp, through Tzeentch's illusions, through the fabric of unreality itself. Each reflection shattered, each future collapsed. The fragments fell inward, reassembling into the single present he chose. The fortress returned. The bound solidified. The sound faded into silence. Tzeentch's laughter turned shrill. "You sing the first song," he hissed. "You dare to use it here?" Sauron's gaze lifted. His armor glowed with the same rhythm as his creation. "You warp meaning. I restore it." The architect recoiled, and for the first time in eternity he found no thread to pull. It was then that the air grew thick with the scent of decay. Nurgle emerged like a continent rising from the sea. His laughter was soft, echoing through the bones of the dead. "They fight," he said, voice slow, gentle, and infinite. "They always fight. But everything dies in time." He exhaled, and rot swept across the citadel. The bound turned to dust. The walls cracked. The fire dimmed. For the first time, Sauron felt weakness, and not pain, but erosion. The power of age and fatigue pressed against him, threatening to dissolve his will into the warm embrace of nothing. Nurgle's hand reached toward him, vast and glistening. "Let it go," he murmured. "Endure no more, rest." Sauron knelt under the weight of it. The forges flickered, their rhythm faltering. Around him the bound began to crumble, their forms collapsing back into the sea of madness. The Maya's armor corroded, flakes of blackened gold falling like ash. For a moment, even he believed it might be over. Then, through the corrosion, through the ruin, but a spark remained. He reached into the flame, grasping something intangible, a single word, a memory from before creation. It was purpose. He spoke it not as sound, but as essence. The flame ignited again, spreading upward through decay, consuming Nurgle's gift. Rot turned to smoke, and smoke to light. Nurgle smiled even as he recoiled. "Ah," he sighed, "you are like me then. You persist." And as the smoke cleared, a new figure stepped forward. The fourth and final. The air shimmered into beauty so perfect it hurt to see. Slaanesh arrived. The Prince of Excess did not roar nor whisper. They simply were. Elegance given form, every curve and color designed to seduce the soul. Their eyes met Sauron's, and for the first time the Maya's flame faltered, not in fear but in recognition. Here stood the ultimate mirror, creation as temptation. "Why fight what you could be?" Slaanesh asked softly, stepping closer. "You are art, fire, power. Why pretend to command when you could simply be adored?" The battlefield stilled. The gods waited. The Maya did not answer. For a heartbeat, the kind that could last an eternity, the fire wavered. Then it flared. His voice cut through the silence, colder than death. "I was adored once. I learned its price, and in that single sentence, Slaanesh saw the one thing they could never possess. Discipline." Their smile vanished. The four gods, their assaults repelled, withdrew to the edges of the warp, each seething in their own way. Yet beneath their rage was something new, uncertainty. For the first time since their birth, they had faced a being who could not be changed. Silence spread across the Imperium like an eclipse. The echoes of battle faded, leaving only the heavy stillness of incomprehension. The four had struck in unison, each embodying the extremities of existence itself, rage, change, decay, and desire, and yet the intruder still stood. His flame did not flicker. It grew. The warp had known defiance before. It had devoured gods who thought themselves immortal. But never had defiance taken this shape, so still, so absolute, so unwilling to yield even to eternity. Sauron's citadel burned at the heart of the storm, not as a light of hope, but as a wound that refused to close. The chaos gods withdrew to their thrones. They were eternal, but eternity can know unease. They spoke in pulses of thought that would have annihilated mortal minds in an instant. Khorne, restless, slammed his gauntlet upon the mountain of skulls that served as his dais. He endures mockery of blood and battle. Let him have his walls. Let him watch as I drown his order in carnage everlasting. Nurgle chuckled, stirring the cauldron of creation and decay. No, no, my dear red fool. He feeds on resistance. Strike him and he grows. Leave him and he festers in peace. All things rot. All things fall. He will too. Tzeentch's voice came like a prism of fire, sharp and many-toned. You misunderstand him. This being does not belong to the pattern. He moves outside it. I cannot see his future because he writes it. He is not chaos, not order. He is the concept of will, and that, my siblings, cannot be permitted. Then Slaanesh leaned forward, eyes glimmering with seductive malice. Perhaps he should not be destroyed. Perhaps he should be absorbed. All strength desires reflection. I would wear his perfection as my own. They debated. They argued. And the warp trembled with their voices. But through it all, one truth remained. The stranger had changed them. For the first time in the eternity of chaos, there was consensus. He must be undone. But in the center of the maelstrom, Sauron was not resting. He was building something greater than any of them could comprehend. The citadel was no longer just a fortress. It was becoming a plane of existence unto itself. Where once the forges hammered in rhythm, now they roared in symphony. The bound worked without pause, their chants forming patterns that wove together thought, time, and law. Every word spoken in that place became binding. Every motion redefined reality. The warp's raw energy was being converted, compressed into architecture. From the upper terraces of his citadel, Sauron surveyed the transformation. The fire of his will had reshaped the Imperium into a mirror of his mind. Walls that once shimmered with demonic flux now gleamed with unyielding certainty. The ground pulsed with structure, not chaos. He named this realm the Silent Dominion. Here, there was no echo, no uncertainty, no flux. The air hummed with the resonance of control. Within its boundaries, the demons that had surrendered to his rule existed in perfect stillness, no longer prey to emotion, no longer slaves to hunger. They became vessels. He did not speak to them as a god speaks to worshippers. He did not promise reward or redemption. His commands were creation itself. Stand, endure, serve, and they did. Through them, Sauron extended his reach. His dominion expanded outward, eating away at the immaterial, consuming unreality itself. The borders of the Eye of Terror flickered. Entire demon worlds disappeared, converted into bastions of form. To the Imperium, this change manifested as miracles of impossible geometry. Warp storms that suddenly quieted, worlds long lost reappearing from the void. Their skies calm, their psychic scars healed. Astropaths wept, believing the Emperor himself had extended his light. They did not know the truth, that the calm was not holy, it was foreign. Within the warp, resistance gathered. The chaos gods, each in their realm, each seething, felt the encroachment like a tightening chain. Their dominions began to shrink. Tzeentch's labyrinths of thought collapsed into singularity. Nurgle's gardens withered where the silent dominion spread. Slaanesh's symphonies of excess fell mute at its border. Even Khorne's rivers of blood began to still, freezing under a law older than violence. It was intolerable. At the summit of his crystal spire, Tzeentch called the council again, not in alliance but in necessity. His eyes, infinite and burning, turned upon his kin. If we continue apart, he will divide us. If we strike together, we may yet unmake his form. Khorne grunted. You ask me to stand beside cowards and deceivers? You will stand, Tzeentch replied, because he will extinguish your fury next. Even Nurgle nodded, his smile dulled. We must reclaim the flux. All that exists must decay. And so they gathered their essence. For the first time since the dawn of sin, the four would combine their might, their will, their hatred into one singular act of creation, or destruction. The warp darkened. The Eye of Terror itself became a sunless void. Stars in the Imperium flickered. Astropaths died screaming as psychic resonance tore through the veil. The chaos gods drew together their forms, their infinite avatars merging into a storm that spanned existence. From it emerged a shape unlike any that had ever been. A colossus woven from contradiction, every element of chaos unified for one single purpose, the convergence of the four. It moved toward the silent dominion, a wall of living distortion devouring everything in its path. Reality fractured before it. Entire dimensions folded. Sauron stood upon the highest tower of his realm, watching the storm come. His flame burned steady, His armor reflected the collapsing horizon. He did not summon his legions. He did not speak. He simply turned his gaze toward the abyss, and for the first time, the abyss looked back in fear. The final war was coming, not for victory, not for survival, but for definition itself. The question was no longer who would rule. It was which truth would remain real when the other was gone. The warp screamed. It was not sound, but sensation. The shattering of a reality that had never been whole. The storm of the gods, the convergence of the four, moved like an apocalypse given form. It blotted out light, thought, and history, rewriting everything it touched into contradiction. At its center pulsed the fused essence of chaos itself, a crown of infinite eyes and burning mouths, a singularity of hunger and contradiction. Rage bled into decay, pleasure into despair, logic into madness. The four were no longer separate wills, but one monstrous identity, all and none. A storm that devoured its own shape even as it formed it. The silent dominion trembled. Towers of light cracked. The bound fell to their knees, not in worship, but in obedience to a terror even their forged discipline could not defy. The air shimmered as the edges of order frayed, the geometry of the citadel dissolving into screams. Sauron stood at its heart, flame unbowed. Around him the forges burned brighter, as though defiance itself were fuel. He raised his gauntleted hand, and the fire of his will coalesced into form, a blazing crown that hovered above his head, its points shaped like broken stars. The Dominion responded. The ground beneath him rippled as every rune, every wall, every law of his creation awakened. His voice cut through the screaming of the warp like iron across silk. Chaos cannot destroy what it cannot define. The words were not prophecy. They were function. The storm struck. It was like eternity colliding with itself. The shockwave erased time. Demons were obliterated before their thoughts could form. Space twisted, folding Sauron's dominion into the body of the convergence. The world became colorless. The laws of reality, and all of them, tore apart. For a moment, even Sauron vanished. And then, the light returned. He rose within the storm. The gods surrounded him, their voices one. You cannot exist here. You are a lie. You are form where there is none. Will where there is only hunger. You are order, and order cannot live. Sauron answered not with words, but with creation. The fire of his essence flared outward, shaping the storm itself. The hands of Khorne became pillars. The breath of Nurgle became mist. Tzeentch's illusions hardened into glass. Slaanesh's beauty crystallized into structure. For the first time in eternity, the Chaos Gods felt something they had never known. Containment. They struck back with their full, united strength. Khorne's fury became a blade of endless momentum, cleaving through thought itself. Tzeentch's mind unleashed paradox after paradox, collapsing reality into recursive madness. Nurgle spread his rot across existence, making every truth decay upon being spoken. Slaanesh's perfection radiated so intensely that it threatened to consume perception itself. And Sauron, one against infinity, stood unbroken. His fire flared brighter than ever, every strike he endured only deepening its hue, turning heat into gravity. Around him the dominion solidified. His will reached through it, bending creation's logic. The warp screams became music. The gods' rage became rhythm. He shaped their destruction into form, turning the storm's chaos into harmony. The convergence faltered. The warp, that great sea of unreason, began to stabilize. The gods felt the unthinkable, constraint. They could still move, still burn, still hunger, but within limits. The storm began to take the shape of a spiral, not disorder but pattern. Tzeentch screamed first. He is rewriting us. Indeed, the architect was right. The warp's essence, on infinite, untamed, divine, was being pulled inward, folded into a single locus, the forge at the heart of the dominion. The ring that hung above it pulsed, absorbing the energy. Every scream, every clash of will was being converted into order, the ultimate act of domination. Sauron stepped forward. His crown blazed with light. The fire from his hands reached out and gripped the storm. You are strength without purpose, he said. You are power without law. You exist because no one commanded you otherwise. He raised the ring and his voice filled the void. Now I command. The warp convulsed. The storm imploded. Reality folded into itself, collapsing inward around the forge. The ring drew it in, gods, demons, realms, even memory. condensing all infinite madness into a single burning point. The eye of terror itself shrank, its edges glowing like a dying star, and within that dying light, the chaos gods screamed as one. You cannot bind what was never free. The ring cracked. The explosion that followed could not be measured in sound or light. It was existence unmade. The warp itself shattered, and for a heartbeat that lasted forever there was nothing. No time, no will, no Sauron, no gods. Only silence. Then, a flicker, a heartbeat of fire, and from the ashes of infinity something began to rise. Not a man, not a god, not chaos, not order. Something new. The essence that had been Sauron coalesced into a form that defied both creation and destruction, a presence woven from both structure and flux. Around it, the shattered fragments of the warp swirled, no longer storm but orbit, no longer hunger but submission. It spoke once, in a voice that made and unmade galaxies. Dominion is balance, and the warp began to obey. When the light finally faded, the Imperium was no longer the same. The warp, that endless sea of madness and hunger, now moved with an unfamiliar rhythm, a heartbeat instead of a storm. Its colors had dimmed, its voices silenced. What had once been chaos eternal now rippled like an ocean beneath the shadow of a single distant sun. At the center of that dim horizon hung a sphere, a wound, a miracle, a scar. The remnants of Sauron's dominion, fragments of his citadel drifted within it like shattered monuments suspended in stillness. The air, if air could exist here, shimmered with afterimages, rings of fire that did not burn, whispers of structure holding back the infinite tide, and from that stillness, new realities began to form. Demons long untamed found themselves bound by limits they could not name. Their shapes solidified, their instincts dulled. They raged and clawed and screamed, but the storms no longer answered them. They were still creatures of the warp, but the sea in which they swam had changed. Its currents gentler, its tempests fewer. To them, it felt like suffocation. To mortals, it felt like deliverance. Across the galaxy, astropaths opened their eyes to a quiet they had never known. The Emperor's light shone clearer than it had in 10 millennia. Warp travel stabilized. Whole sectors, once lost to madness, became navigable again. Worlds cut off for centuries suddenly heard the hum of the Astronomican. The Imperium called it a miracle, but miracles are never free. In the depths of the Eye of Terror, where the gods once reigned supreme, there was only absence. The brass citadel stood silent, its rivers of blood turned to stone. Nurgle's garden withered into lifeless ash, its blossoms dead, its laughter gone. Tzeentch's crystalline labyrinths cracked. The colors inside faded into pale glass. And Slaaneish's palace, that eternal song of desire, echoed now with only the whisper of memory. The four were not gone. Not entirely. Their essence remained, scattered through the warp like embers of a fire too vast to truly die. But they no longer ruled. They drifted, they remembered, and they hated. In that shared emptiness, their thoughts converged, for hate is the most enduring form of life. Yet even their hate was quiet now, stripped of voice and shape. They waited, knowing eternity always gives birth to new storms. And in the center of it all, upon the still waters of what had been the greatest wound in existence, stood a figure. He was smaller now, his flame tempered, his armor dull with the soot of what had been creation's final forge. His eyes burned, but softly, as if the fire within him no longer sought dominion, only endurance. The crown he had forged lay broken at his feet. He looked upon the silent horizon and saw no gods, no armies, no worlds. Only his reflection in the still light of the new warp. For a moment he considered triumph. He had tamed the untamable. He had imposed law upon madness. Yet as he stood amid his perfect stillness, a deeper truth began to dawn upon him. One older than power, older than victory. Without struggle, there is no will. Without chaos, there can be no order. In conquering the warp, he had begun to unmake the very essence of his own existence. He had not destroyed chaos. He had become it, rewritten into stillness. His dominion was no kingdom. It was a tomb. He gazed down at his reflection, fire framed by void, and spoke not in command but confession. There is no dominion without resistance. The stillness trembled. A single ripple crossed the surface of the new warp. Another followed. Then another. The tide began to move again. Not violently, not as before, but with rhythm, with choice. The warp was not healed. It was reborn, and the being who had once been Sauron, Maya tyrant god, turned and stepped into the fire. The dominion flared one last time, brilliant and silent, before collapsing into the void. When it faded, only the echo remained, a faint pulse within the Imperium, like the breath of a sleeping world. The chaos gods stirred, half dreaming, half remembering. In that rhythm they found life again, rage, hunger, desire, change. The warp would rise anew. But it would never again be as it was. It had been shaped once, and in that shaping it had learned something it could not forget. Will. Somewhere, deep in the Emperor's palace on Terra, the master of mankind opened his eyes. For a moment the Astronomican flickered, brighter, steadier, almost alive. He felt the current of the Imperium shifting beneath his throne, the faint scent of order in the chaos that had plagued mankind since the dawn of its age. He did not smile. He only whispered a single word, one no mortal could have heard, though it echoed across the stars nonetheless. Who? And far beyond his hearing, beyond the veil, a voice whispered back, distant, calm, eternal. No one. Only will. The warp breathed again, and so the cycle continued.